In a city filled with luxury and power, James Carter, a successful CEO, seemed to have it all. But when he faces two children who don't even know him, he realizes that there are things money cannot buy. Can he find his family after years of abandonment? And can old wounds be healed? This journey will change his life forever. A cold wind swept through Rose Hill Cemetery, carrying the biting breath of a Chicago winter. The rows of barren trees stood stark against the gray sky, their leafless branches reaching up like desperate hands. James Carter stood silently before a freshly carved headstone, Emily Dawson. The chill pierced through his thick coat, but he paid it no mind. The emptiness in his chest was far colder than any wind. Years had passed since he last saw her, but now all that remained was a silent grave. The earth beneath his feet was still damp, marked by the rain from the day before etched into the grass. She was truly gone. A week, 7 days had passed, yet the feelings still didn't seem real. James had never been one to let emotions overtake him. His life was built on decisive choices, precise numbers, and unrelenting negotiation. But today, he was just a solitary man facing an irreversible loss. He had loved her once. Loved her in the way of an ambitious man, instinctive, passionate, yet selfish. Back when they were together, Emily was a breath of freedom in his world, a woman who carried both gentleness and intensity within her. She had loved him too, but that love wasn't enough to anchor her in the frigid realm of billion-dollar contracts and endless late-night meetings. And then she left. Without a single word of blame, she left behind only a simple note: "I love you, but I can't wait forever." 5 years had passed, and James never once sought her out, not because he didn't miss her, but because he convinced himself they belonged to two different worlds. He imagined she'd moved on with her life, perhaps with another man, someone who'd put her first instead of prioritizing deals and stocks. But now, she was here, beneath this cold earth, and he no longer had the chance to ask her anything. A stronger gust of wind swept through, sending dry leaves swirling around the quiet cemetery. At that moment, a small voice broke through from behind him, pulling him from his thoughts. "Mommy, I miss you." James flinched. He turned around, and his heart seemed to stop. Just a few steps away, 2 boys stood beside the grave. They couldn't have been older than 7. Dressed in simple clothes, their oversized coats hanging loosely on their small frames. Their thin shoulders trembled in the biting wind, and the tiny hand of one boy rested on the headstone as if trying to touch the mother who was gone. James stood frozen, staring at the children as a strange feeling welled up inside him. A confusion, a sharp pain stabbing at the deepest part of his heart. But what he couldn't tear his eyes away from was their eyes. The older boy's eyes, deep, rich brown, sharp with a hint of wariness. The younger boy's, clear as a stream, shining with innocence, yet shadowed by loss. James swallowed hard. His throat felt parched. It couldn't be. His breath quickened as the boys' gazes brushed past him. The younger one blinked, then turned to the older one. "Noah." "Who's that man?" Noah. The name hit James like a punch to the chest. A terrifying truth, a horrifying thought, began to creep into his mind. He stared at the boys' faces, their features, their expressions. And then, like a bolt of lightning tearing through the gloomy sky, realization crashed over him like a tsunami. They looked too much like him. This wasn't random. It couldn't be a coincidence. James stumbled back a step, the world tilting beneath his feet. Emily had left him carrying a secret he'd never known. James Carter stood there, unable to tear his eyes away from the 2 boys. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing heavy as though he'd just been struck by a devastating blow. These boys, they resembled him too much for it to be a coincidence. Noah, the older one, squinted at him warily, his brows knitting together slightly. It was a defensive reaction, not unlike James himself when he was young. Meanwhile, Lucas, the younger one, showed a flicker of curiosity, but the shyness and sorrow etched into his innocent eyes made James's heart clench. He started to take a step forward, but a voice stopped him in his tracks. "I think you shouldn't be standing there staring at the kids like that." James turned sharply. An older woman was approaching him. She wore a thick gray coat, her graying hair neatly tied back, her eyes sharp, yet tinged with exhaustion. What caught his attention most, though, was the protective way she drew Noah and Lucas closer to her as she neared. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Who are you?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She studied him, as if assessing a man she'd heard about many times but had never met. A heavy silence settled between them. Finally she sighed. "I'm Margaret Hayes. I've been looking after these boys since Emily passed." That name, when spoken aloud, cut through James like a blade. A chill ran down his spine. "They?" James glanced down at the boys, his voice hoarse. "They're mine, aren't they?" Margaret tightened her grip on the boy's shoulders, her gaze hardening. "You didn't know." James felt the world crumble around him. No, he didn't know. How could he have known? Emily had never said a word. If he'd known, he would never have let her raise them alone like that. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, his voice more desperate than he'd intended. "Why did she keep it from me?" Margaret looked at him, her eyes not filled with anger but with a deep, palpable disappointment. "You really don't know, do you, James Carter?" He opened his mouth to respond but stopped short, realizing maybe he truly didn't know. He didn't know what Emily had gone through, didn't know the struggles she'd faced after leaving him, and perhaps he himself had been the reason she believed he didn't deserve to. "No, she left me," James muttered, as if justifying it to himself. "I thought she'd found a better life. I didn't think." Margaret let out a faint, humorless laugh, devoid of any warmth. "No, James. She didn't find a better life. She fought every single day to raise these boys, alone." The word alone echoed in James's mind like a condemnation. "Did you know?" Margaret continued, her voice lowering. "Emily never hated you. On the contrary, she still loved you, even though she knew you'd never put her above your numbers and contracts." James felt as if someone had punched him in the chest. It hurt. He looked down at Noah and Lucas. These boys, small pieces of Emily, parts of her he'd never known existed. All these years, he'd lived in his own world, too busy to realize what he'd lost. "I want to know about them," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I want to be their father." Margaret tightened her grip on Noah's hand, and the older boy immediately stepped closer to her. Clearly, he was used to protecting Lucas and himself from strangers. To Noah, James was just that, a stranger. "It's not that simple, James," Margaret said. "They don't need a man showing up out of nowhere claiming to be their father. They need stability, not some vague promise." James stiffened. "I'm not a vague promise." "Are you sure?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You've been absent for the first 7 years of their lives. If Emily were still alive, you might never have known they existed. So tell me, James, what makes you think you have the right to step into their lives now?" Silence stretched between them. James didn't have an immediate answer. All he knew was that for the first time in his life, he didn't care about work, wealth, or the things he'd once deemed most important. All he knew was he'd already lost too much. He couldn't lose any more. Margaret looked deep into his eyes, as if searching for something within this man. Then she let out a soft sigh. "I can't stop you from learning about them," she said slowly, "but I won't let you hurt them either." James nodded. He didn't need her permission, but he did need the trust of these boys. And to earn that, he knew he'd have to fight. Not in the boardroom, but on the battlefield of the heart. And that was the most important fight he'd ever faced. James Carter couldn't shake the image of the two boys from his mind. Their eyes, especially Noah's sharp, guarded gaze, haunted him every time he closed his eyes. From the moment he realized he was their father, an urgent feeling surged within him. He couldn't let them slip away from him any longer. But how could he reach these boys when they saw him as a stranger, when the older one was steeped in hurt and anger, and the younger one was cautious yet curious? James had won countless tough deals, but this wasn't a negotiation. This was about children, his sons. That day, he waited outside Noah and Lucas's elementary school. The final bell rang, and the sound of children laughing and chattering filled the courtyard. Then he saw them, two small figures stepping out of the gate. Noah gripped Lucas's hand tightly, his eyes scanning their surroundings as if on guard against something. James took a deep breath and approached. Noah, Lucas. Noah froze instantly, his gaze cutting into James like a blade. "What are you doing here?" Lucas looked up at James, curiosity flickering in his brown eyes, though he didn't dare step closer. Caught between a desire to understand and an invisible fear, the younger boy clung tighter to his brother's hand. James realized Noah wasn't just a 7-year-old boy. He was his little brother's protector, and he didn't trust James. He tried to keep his voice steady. "I just want to talk." "We don't have anything to say to you," Noah shot back, his tone so cold that James had to clench his fists to stay composed. But Lucas was different. He studied James for a few more seconds before asking in a small voice, "Are you really our dad?" The question pierced James's chest like a dagger. He knelt down, leveling his gaze with Lucas's. "Yes, I'm your dad." Lucas frowned, as if trying to process the information, but before he could say more, Noah yanked his hand, shielding him from James. "Let's go, Lucas." "But Noah." "Go." Noah's voice was firm, and he dragged his brother away without looking back. James could only watch them disappear beyond the school gate, his heart sinking. But James Carter wasn't someone who gave up easily. The next day, he went to the park near their neighborhood. According to his assistant, every Saturday afternoon, Noah and Lucas played soccer there with other kids. And sure enough, he spotted them from a distance. Lucas was kicking a ball with enthusiasm, his small but nimble feet darting across the grass, a bright smile lighting up his face whenever he scored. Noah, though, was different. He stood at the edge of the field, arms crossed, watching the game as if he didn't really want to join in. James approached slowly. He didn't want to scare them, didn't want to make things worse than they already were. Lucas noticed him first. He stopped playing, his eyes lighting up faintly, but then he glanced at Noah, waiting for his brother's reaction. James picked up the ball that had rolled to his feet, turning it lightly in his hands before offering a smile. "You're really good at soccer, Lucas." Lucas licked his lips, shy under the praise. "I like soccer." "I liked it too when I was younger," James said, though the truth was he'd never really played sports. But if it meant connecting with his son, he'd try. Noah stepped forward, positioning himself between James and Lucas. "Why do you keep following us?" He sighed, knowing he had to be honest. "Because I've already missed too much. I can't turn back time, but I can at least try now." "Too late," Noah replied coldly, snatching the ball from James's hands and kicking it hard back toward the field, a decisive move to end the conversation. Lucas lingered, looking at James with a mix of confusion and curiosity. James met his gaze and said, "I won't force you, but if you ever want to talk, anytime, I'll be here." Noah tugged Lucas away, but just before they left, Lucas glanced back, his eyes shimmering with something unclear. Perhaps hesitation, perhaps hope. That night, James sat in his car, his mind blank as he stared out at the quiet street. He'd always been the one in control of billion-dollar deals, of strategic decisions, but now he was utterly powerless before his own sons. He could see Lucas starting to grow curious, but Noah had built a wall around his heart, too strong for a boy his age. A wall forged from long nights without a father, from years of watching his mother struggle. A wall of hurt and loss. But James wouldn't let it stand forever. He'd failed in the past. This time, he'd fight to reclaim the family he never knew he'd lost. James Carter had never feared confrontation. He had negotiated with the most ruthless businessmen, outwitted the most powerful figures in finance. But standing before a 7-year-old boy with eyes full of hurt and anger, he realized this battle was harder than any deal he'd ever faced. Noah wasn't like Lucas. The boy wasn't curious, wasn't swayed by promises or James's patient presence. Noah looked at him as if he were a loathsome stranger, someone who never should have come back. And tonight, in the elementary school auditorium, that became clearer than ever. The school performance took place in the warm glow of a small auditorium, filled with the lively chatter and laughter of parents eager to see their children shine on stage. James sat near the back row, hoping he could watch without drawing too much attention. Lucas had excitedly invited him. The younger boy was performing in a short play with his class. But Noah hadn't invited him. And when the boy stepped onto the stage with his classmates, his gaze briefly landed on James, a frozen, piercing look, as if James' presence was a stain on his important night. James could feel the quiet fury radiating from Noah, even though the boy didn't say a word. The play ended to thunderous applause. Lucas ran toward James with a beaming smile, proudly announcing that he'd memorized all his lines without a single mistake. James ruffled his son's hair, smiling back. But then, when his eyes sought out Noah, the boy had vanished from the auditorium. James found Noah outside the school, standing alone in the cold night. The boy had his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes darkening as James approached. Noah's breath came out in small puffs of vapor in the frigid air, but he didn't shiver. "Why do you keep following us?" Noah's voice was low, but it carried the weight of a storm of suppressed emotions. James stopped a few steps away. "Because I'm your father." Noah let out a laugh, a cold, bitter sound that didn't belong to a 7-year-old. "Father? You think just because you say that, I'll believe you?" James swallowed hard. "I know it's hard for you to accept, but it's the truth." Noah clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "The truth? The truth is you weren't there when Mom needed you. The truth is she cried for years while you lived comfortably in your fancy apartment." James stiffened. "I didn't know. If I had, I wouldn't have let that happen." Noah took a step forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "No. You did know. You knew you left her. You knew you weren't there. You just didn't care." James shook his head, his voice dropping. "That's not true, Noah." But the boy wasn't listening anymore. He'd held these feelings inside for too long. The nights he saw his mother sitting silently by the window, the days she forced a smile despite her red-rimmed eyes, the times Lucas asked about Dad and Noah didn't know how to answer. And now this man, the one who'd abandoned them, stood before him, claiming he wanted to come back. Noah couldn't stand it. "You don't have the right to be here," Noah said, his voice choking but resolute. "You're not my family. I don't need you." For the first time in his life, James Carter felt his heart truly shatter. He wanted to tell Noah he was wrong, that he wanted to be a good father, that he'd never stopped loving their mother, but none of that would mean anything to a child who'd lost so much, who'd hurt for so long. James took a deep breath. "Noah, I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just hope you'll give me a chance." Noah shook his head. "There's no chance. You weren't there when Mom needed you, and now she's gone. Don't expect me to trust you." Those words stabbed through James's heart like a knife. Noah turned away, his small but proud figure striding back toward the auditorium. James didn't follow. He knew he couldn't change Noah's mind with just a few words, but he also knew one thing for certain. The boy could push him away as many times as he wanted. James would still stay, because this time, James Carter wasn't running away. This time, he would fight for his family. James Carter couldn't recall how long he'd been sitting in his car parked outside Darkness had swallowed the Chicago sky, the streetlights casting a cold, isolating glow. He stared at the small house in front of him, where his sons were, but not with him. The confrontation with Noah, 2 days ago, still echoed in his mind like an unresolved sentence. The boy's words, full of anger, full of hurt, reverberated in his head, and each time he replayed them, he felt like a failure all over again. But giving up was never an option. That afternoon, he'd received a message from Margaret. They have soccer practice at the park on Saturday morning. If you really want to do something for them, start with the smallest things. Margaret hadn't said she accepted him. She hadn't said Noah or Lucas would open up to him. But she'd given him an opportunity, and that meant he still had a chance to fight. Saturday morning, Washington Park. The whistle pierced the air over the grassy field. Children cheered, and the sound of the ball bouncing mingled with shouts of encouragement. James stood at the edge of the field, trying to appear unthreatening to the kids around him. He quickly spotted Lucas among the group chasing the ball. The small boy was agile, his feet gliding decisively across the grass, his face alight with excitement every time he touched the ball. Lucas loved soccer. But Noah. The older boy stood off to the side, arms crossed, eyes narrowed as he watched the game. He didn't join in, didn't cheer. He simply observed. James watched his son from a distance, his chest tightening. Noah wasn't an ordinary 7-year-old. He was quieter than the other kids, his eyes carrying a guardedness that shouldn't belong to a child so young, and that only made James want to get closer. He took a deep breath and walked over slowly. Noah noticed him immediately. The boy stiffened, his gaze turning icy. "What are you doing here?" Noah's voice held no surprise. It was as if he'd grown accustomed to James showing up in unexpected places. James glanced at the field, watching my sons play soccer. Noah smirked, his eyes flicking over James with skepticism. "You're not my dad." James didn't argue. He couldn't force Noah to believe him with just words. Instead, he shifted his gaze to Lucas, who was cheering gleefully after scoring a goal. "Lucas is really good." This time, Noah didn't respond right away. He silently watched his little brother. For a fleeting moment, James caught a glimmer of pride in the boy's eyes, but it vanished as Noah turned back to him, his expression hardening. "Again, you don't get to come here just to pretend you care." James crouched down to Noah's level, his voice low. "I'm not pretending, Noah. I'm here because I want to be. So what, are you going to buy us gifts? Use money to make me like you?" James clenched his fists. "I know you think I'm just a stranger. I know you have every reason to be angry, but I'm not here to bribe anyone." Noah didn't reply, just stared at him, as if weighing whether James was worth trusting. At that moment, Lucas ran over, his face flushed from exertion but brimming with excitement. "Uncle James," he called out eagerly, his eyes shining. "Did you see? I just scored a goal." James smiled. "I saw you played great." Lucas giggled, clearly delighted by the praise. But then he glanced at his brother, sensing the tension between them. He tugged Noah's hand, his voice innocent but tinged with a plea. "Noah, come play." "You're always just watching." Noah hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't like playing." Lucas pouted. "That's not fair. You're always on the sidelines. If you don't play, I won't either." Noah opened his mouth to protest, but then sighed, his resolve wavering. James spoke up instinctively. "You could try, just once." Noah whipped around to face him. "You don't get to tell me what to do." James didn't get angry, he just shrugged. "I just thought you might like it. If you don't, you can stop." Noah bit his lip as if wrestling with himself. Finally, he turned to Lucas and sighed reluctantly. "Fine, just once." Lucas cheered with joy, pulling his brother toward the field. James watched the two boys, his heart pounding in his chest. It was only a small step, but with Noah it might as well have been a mountain. Noah still didn't trust him. But he hadn't pushed James away this time, and for James that was a victory. A small step, but a crucial one. Noah sat alone on the windowsill of his bedroom, his gaze fixed on the void ahead. The Chicago night was quieter than usual, the distant lights from towering buildings casting a pale glow across the sky. In his hands was an old envelope, its edges worn as if someone had held and read it countless times before. His mother's letter. He'd found it in Margaret's drawer that afternoon. An unsent letter, written to him, the man trying to force his way into Noah's life, the man Noah had rejected for the past 7 years. Noah knew he shouldn't read it, but something compelled him, a strange feeling flickering in his chest like a small flame, and when the first lines appeared under the dim lamplight, his heart clenched tight. James, if you're reading this, I probably no longer have the chance to tell you these things myself. I'm not writing to blame or resent you. I just want you to know. I once hoped you'd come find me. I once wished you'd show up one day, realizing that you didn't just lose me but missed out on the two most wonderful children in the world. But then I understood. Some things can't be undone. You have your world, and I couldn't hold you back just because of my love for you. If one day you learn about them, please, James, don't just come and go like a breeze passing through their lives. If you truly want to be their father, stay. Fight for them. Don't let them think they aren't important enough to keep you. And, James, if you read this, know that I never hated you. Emily. Noah gripped the letter tightly, his heart aching with every beat. His mother had never hated him. For years he'd built an image of a man who abandoned them, a man who made his mother suffer, a man who didn't deserve them. But now, he wasn't so sure anymore. And that scared him. He was afraid he'd been wrong. 2 hours later, James Carter's apartment. When James opened the door, he didn't expect to see Noah standing there. The boy didn't speak right away. He stood silently, clutching the letter, his eyes shadowed as if wrestling with himself. James felt his heartbeat slow. He was used to Noah's cold stares, but this time, something was different. "We need to talk," Noah said, his voice lacking its usual sharpness. James paused for a second, then stepped aside. "Come in." Noah walked in, his small sneakers making faint sounds on the polished wooden floor. He didn't look around or marvel at James's luxurious apartment like Lucas often did. He just looked at him, a gaze full of conflict. James sat across from the boy, careful not to close the distance too much. "I'm listening." Noah placed the letter on the table. He didn't push it toward James or hide it. "I read Mom's letter." The world seemed to freeze. James didn't dare touch the envelope. His heart pounded, a quiet fear seeping into his veins. Emily had left this for him? She had never hated him? Noah watched him, his sharp eyes trying to read every flicker of emotion on James's face. "She waited for you," the boy said, his voice low, almost an accusation. "She hoped you'd come back, but you didn't." James closed his eyes, pain washing over him like a wave. "I didn't know," he whispered. Noah gave a faint, bitter laugh. "You always say that, but does it even matter? If you cared, you would have looked for us. You would have looked for her." James opened his eyes, meeting Noah's gaze head on. "I was wrong." Noah flinched slightly at the blunt admission. "I was wrong, Noah," James continued, his voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't search for you. I thought your mom had forgotten me, moved on. I convinced myself I didn't matter to her anymore. But that's not an excuse. I was wrong." For the first time, Noah didn't have an immediate retort. He just sat there, his face betraying a flicker of hesitation. James took a deep breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't expect you to trust me now, but I'm not going anywhere. I won't leave, Noah." The boy clenched his fists. "Mom said not to be a breeze passing through our lives." James nodded, his gaze steady. "I won't be." Noah stared at him for a long time. For the first time, James saw a hint of vulnerability in those eyes. Not pure anger anymore, but fear. The boy wanted to believe him, but he'd lost too much to let himself do so easily. "I don't know how to feel about you," Noah finally said, his voice quieter. James swallowed, feeling something break inside him. He didn't expect Noah to hug him or call him Dad right then, but that single sentence, it was a start. End of the situation. When Noah left that night, James stood by the window, watching the small figure fade into the darkness. He didn't know where things would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. Noah hadn't turned his back on him this time. And sometimes that was all he needed to keep fighting. Spring arrived in Chicago slowly. The lingering cold finally gave way to warm rays of sunlight filtering through the trees, still dappled with morning dew. Small flowers bloomed along the pathways, blending with the faint scent of the earth awakening after a long winter. James Carter walked slowly down the gravel path leading into Rose Hill Cemetery, a place of memories, losses, and now, new beginnings. But today he wasn't alone. He glanced down at the two boys beside him. Lucas clutched a bouquet of white flowers tightly, his face more serious than his usual playful demeanor. And Noah, the quiet, resilient boy, said nothing, but his eyes no longer held the icy edge they had the first time they'd met here. This time, he'd come willingly with James. The three of them stopped before the headstone bearing Emily Dawson's name. A gentle breeze swept through, carrying a few dry leaves, leaving the air so still that James could hear the soft breathing of the two boys. Lucas knelt down, carefully placing the flowers in front of his mother's grave. "Hi, Mom," he whispered. Noah stood beside, his brother, his gaze fixed on the headstone as if searching for something, a secret, a message, something he'd never fully understood. James didn't speak right away. He knew there were moments when words weren't needed, when presence alone was enough. But after a while, Noah broke the silence. His voice no longer carried its usual sharpness. Instead, it held a rare gentleness. "Mom, we're okay." James felt his chest tighten. Noah looked down at his hands, then clenched them slightly as if gathering the courage to continue. "And I think you'd want him here." Those words, simple, yet more meaningful than anything James had ever heard. Noah didn't say Dad, didn't say he'd fully forgiven him, but he had accepted James. For the first time, James felt he truly belonged to something beyond skyscrapers and billion-dollar contracts. He knelt down, placing one hand on Noah's shoulder and the other on Lucas's. "Your mom will always be proud of you both." Noah stayed quiet for a moment, then gave a small nod. Lucas smiled, then suddenly grabbed James's hand. And what surprised James even more, Noah didn't pull away. The breeze blew through again, but this time it wasn't cold. It was just a spring breeze, gentle, forgiving, and full of hope. 1 week later, at James's house, Noah stood in the kitchen, watching James fumble with a spoon and struggle with a pan of eggs on the stove. The boy crossed his arms, shaking his head with clear skepticism. "You've never cooked before, have you?" James grimaced, nodding as if admitting defeat. "I've never had to, but for you two, I'll learn." Lucas burst out laughing, pulling a chair up to the counter. "So we're about to have a interesting meal." Noah maintained his cool demeanor, but for the first time, a faint spark of amusement flickered in his eyes. James looked at Noah and asked softly, "Want to try helping?" Noah stared at him for a long moment. James didn't push, didn't expect anything. It was just an offer, a way of saying the choice was his. Finally, Noah stepped forward, taking the spoon from James's hand. "You're doing it all wrong," he muttered, then began stirring the eggs with practiced ease. James laughed, stepping aside to give him room. This time, Noah didn't push him away. This time, the boy chose to stay. Conclusion: James Carter did what the future held. He knew there would be tough days, moments when Noah would still be wary, times when the boy would retreat into his hard shell, but he also knew one thing for certain. This time, he wouldn't leave, because this time, they were no longer scattered pieces. This time, they were truly a family.